Good afternoon and good morning to those of us joining from the US. And welcome to the Turing Institute's virtual lecture, Challenging Power in Data Science. My name's Ruth Arnott and I am PI of one of the Turing Institute's flagship projects, Living with Machines. And on behalf of my co-organizers, Kirsty Whitaker and Anika York, I am delighted to be welcoming our esteemed guests, Catherine D'Ignazio and Klein. We are so honoured that they accepted this invitation to speak. And the fact that almost 700 people have signed up to this event tells us a lot about the need for sustained critical intervention on the topic of challenging power in data science, and indeed in society at large. The volume of interest suggests that Catherine and Lauren don't really need an introduction, but I'm going to give them one anyway. Catherine D'Ignazio is an assistant professor of urban science and planning in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT, and she's also the director of Data Plus Feminism Lab, which uses data and computational methods to work towards gender and racial equality, particularly as they relate to space and place. Lauren F. Klein is associate professor in the departments of English and quantitative theory and methods at Emory University, where she also directs the Digital Humanities Lab. The reason that we invited them both here today is that Lauren and Catherine are co-authors of the much-awaited book Data Feminism that was published with MIT Press in March this year. It is already creating a really big impact, and if you haven't read it already, I strongly encourage you to purchase it or to read the open access version, which you can find online, just Google it. The book proposes a new way of thinking about data science and data ethics, one that's informed by intersectional feminist thought. Catherine and Lauren's scholarship speaks especially to different and intersecting domains of power that create oppression, and which in turn create dominant and minoritized groups. More importantly, they propose a set of values and actions for overcoming these structural inequalities. The pressing need for such discussion could not be clearer at this moment, following the 9th day of protests in the US following the murder of George Floyd against ongoing and systemic racial injustice. Although Brits like to think that things are better here, testimony from our BME population would beg to differ. Moreover, we're facing further unrest over a first delayed and then inadequate inquiry into why Black and minority ethnic groups have been disproportionately affected by the coronavirus. Against this backdrop, we are reminded that data and technology are not neutral. They can perpetuate and amplify the injustice and harm we see in physical spaces. There is then a call to attune ourselves to those structures of oppression when working with data, so we can redress the imbalances of power that underpin our society. Having read Catherine and Lauren's book, I know that they're going to provide some important provocations for us today. They're going to speak now for about 40 minutes, and then we'll use the remainder of our hour to field some questions. Now for some housekeeping. As you know, the event will be recorded. We are using Zoom, and those of you who are familiar with Zoom webinars, and those of you who are not, can I invite you to submit your questions for Catherine and Lauren via the Q&A and not the chat. You can also upvote questions which you're very keen to hear asked. 50 of you will also be joining us for the virtual drinks reception and chat, and you should have received the invitation and Zoom link. We're really sorry not to be able to have more of you with us, but we have been utterly overwhelmed by the interest in this event. So thank you once again, everybody, for joining us, and we now hand over to our speakers.
Thank you so much, Ruth, for that generous introduction. It's a huge pleasure to be here. It's also a huge pleasure to have so many people here with us. That's been maybe one of the blessings of COVID times, is that we get to be in community with so many more people than would otherwise be coming to our little events in small bookstores or in academic institutions. So thank you all for taking time out of your day for this. I'm going to share my slides. Let's see, do y'all see the slides? Let me just make sure I see the slides. Okay, here we go. So I'm not gonna spend too much time introducing Lauren and myself because that was a great introduction. Only to just say that it's been a pleasure. This is a collaboratively written book, and it's been a real pleasure to do this work together. What we wanted to do first, before we jump into talking about the book, we wanted to just take a minute to acknowledge the unjust deaths of 4 people in the United States: Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Tony McDade. Just to say, this is a incredible moment right now. Right now in our country, protests continue to be held in response to the murder of George Floyd and others. He was killed at the hands of the Minneapolis police, along with many other Black men and women who have also been killed by police in the past several weeks. In our book, we talk a lot about the anti-Blackness and the structural racism that underlies this police violence. And these murders remind us that the stakes of structural inequality are very high. So it's literally who lives and dies. And this is true not only in the US context, of course, but around the world. So one of the things we thought we could do today is invite especially the white listeners today to think really hard about how we can use this moment to commit to our own anti-racist practice. The families of Ahmaud, of George, of Breonna, and of Tony are mourning right now, and it is our work to dismantle the broken systems that cause this grief. So I think I would like to pass to Lauren to tell you about some of the ways that we can engage.
Sure. I'll echo Catherine and everything that she said. Her words speak for both of us. And I think, there are many actions that one could take. We thought just before we begin, we would feature a few very specific resources that have influenced our own thinking and our actions just in this past week. So you see here, there's 3 links, but 4 resources. The first is the Prison Abolition Syllabus 2.0, created by the African American Intellectual History Society. This was initially drafted in response to nationwide prison strike in 2016, actually, and then revised in 2018, but everything that is there still applies. It goes back as far as Jeremy Bentham to tell the history of punishment and sort of criminalization in an Anglo-Western context. Then it works its way back up into the present, closing with a week on the prison abolition movement, which is really closely connected to recent calls for police abolition. And I think Catherine, while I'm speaking, is going to put all of these links in the chat in case you want to check them out. The second one is a Google Doc that was created really only in the past week called Scaffolded Anti-Racist Resources. And it is just a synthesis of existing resources, but shows how white people in particular can sort of continue the work of becoming better allies and more anti-racist. And in particular, suggest tools for engagement. Like, if you got to the point in dialogue where you hear, oh, well, I'm not really racist, then how do you engage and how do you move forward? If you get to the point where someone is saying like, oh, I get it, I am implicated, but I don't really know what to do, then how do you move forward? And it's very clear, and I'm hoping that many of you will find sort of very specific ways that you can connect and advance conversations that are taking place. And then the final link that we have is a set of resources for accountability and action for Black lives. And much like the previous document, this one provides, it's mostly in a US context, but the organizations that are accepting money can accept money from anywhere. But it includes a list of phone numbers you can call, email addresses you can email, petitions you can sign about specific policies that are being decided right now in response to the protests of the past week and a bit, and sort of ongoing struggles against the police industrial system and for Black lives. And then finally, the image that you see is just a really helpful infographic that has been circulating around the internet the past week, just emphasizing the fact that many of us really do want to take action, and we're actually seeing a lot of opportunities come our way in all of our social media channels on things we can do. And it offers some really good advice about how you choose, which efforts to amplify and which ones to engage. And so hopefully you can see it all there, but similarly, you can Google that one. That comes from the sort of anti-racism consultant group, lauriemack.com. And maybe Catherine, I forgot to put that link in our little notes, but maybe if you, I'll find that if you can't do that right now. So those are just, a couple of resources that have been speaking to us recently, but we thought that we wanted to get a little bit more specific about the work that we're doing in this past week. And hopefully some of those resources will be helpful to all of you. So now I'm going to pass it back to Catherine to begin our talk about the book.
Great. So, the way that we're going to structure this is we want to give you a little bit of the background and motivation for we want to sort of situate data feminism and what motivated the work. And then we're going to dive a little deeper and talk about some of the examples and the principles of data feminism that we developed. So just as background, we see data feminism as part of a growing body of work, an exciting body of work that's holding corporate and government actors accountable for their racist, sexist, classist data products. So these are things that are probably not, that folks who are attending today probably have heard of. So things like face detection systems that cannot see women of color, hiring out algorithms that demote applicants that went to all women's schools, search algorithms that circulate negative stereotypes about Black girls, child abuse detection algorithms that punish poor parents, data visualizations that reinforce the gender binary, all these things and more. And so, what's been very encouraging is just that even during the time that we've been writing this book, this whole kind of body of work has emerged in a lot of different sectors. We are highlighting some of that, some of our favorites and most inspirational works here at the bottom of the slide, which has been really a pushback to the meme that you see at the top of this slide, which is data is the new oil. And I think it wasn't really a meme, like it was never an animated GIF, but I think about this as a meme because this is something that The Economist magazine said back in the early 2010s. They said data is the new oil, and then that got kind of picked up. You can go around YouTube and hear lots of folks like CEOs and ministries and things like this saying data is the new oil, data is the new oil. It's kind of like the hype. But it's a really interesting metaphor, of course, because I think and they mean it in a positive way. So they mean that data is this natural resource. It's just out there, and we can go mine it. We can extract it, and by extracting and mining and processing it, we can turn it into profit. But then the question of this always is, the feminist question is profit for whom? And so that's what this inspiring work of the past 5 years has been doing, is really pushing back against that narrative, and in particular against the idea that that narrative actually benefits folks other than those folks who are already in the dominant social groups. And so what we see collectively from many folks is this idea that actually data is the same old oppression. It's just in sort of slightly new garb. It's maybe slightly more accelerated, but it's the same old oppression. And we hear that in particular from women of color, from white women, from indigenous people, from immigrant communities, LGBTQ folks, and more. So what our contribution is to this emerging body of work is what we can bring to the table is specifically a feminist perspective. And the reason we want to do a little bit of level setting here around the word feminism. It's a word that folks bring a lot of kind of diverse pathways and histories into. So we want to be specific about which feminism we're mobilizing in the book. So back in 2017, following the election of the current US president, the Women's March on Washington, this was the year of the Me Too movement exploded. The dictionary, Merriam-Webster, made feminism their word of the year. So it's worth just thinking about what is feminism? So first of all, feminism is a belief. If we're going to follow Beyonce, a feminist is a person who believes in equal rights for men and women and non-binary people. But then secondly to this belief, it implies a commitment to action, because if you believe in equal rights for all of the genders, then you can look around and you see that those equal rights are not happening right now. And so this implies organized action to realize those equal rights. So feminism is also organized activity on behalf of women's and non-binary people's rights and interests. And then I think here I'll pass it to Lauren, because it's not only a belief and it's not only action, but feminism is also an intellectual heritage, and a really awesome one. Go ahead.
Great, thank you. Yeah, right. So feminism is also this really rich set of theories and ideas. And these theories began by thinking through issues of inequality with respect to sex and gender. But the past 40 years of, probably even longer, of scholarship and action, and also sort of the current and ongoing political reality, have brought many, many more dimensions of inequality into the conversation. So these include race, they include class, sexuality, ability, and more. And this leads to sort of the most important takeaway from this little brief overview of feminism, which is that in the year 2020, feminism must be understood as intersectional. And I think many listeners probably know this, but I think it's important to sort of pay homage to this lineage. This was a term coined by the legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, which she uses to explain how social inequality cannot be explained by only one dimension of difference, like gender. When we talk about inequality or oppression, we must talk about the intersection of the many factors and forces that produce it. So this is like the racism and the classism and the colonialism that we referenced above. And the key thing to understand about intersectionality, and this is actually a thing that is often overlooked, is that intersectionality doesn't just describe the markers of individual identity, right? It's not just, you know, I am white, I am able-bodied, you know, it's not just, you know, these markers of identity about me. It describes the structural forces of power and their intersection that create those effects. And it's really the work of women of color feminists and Black feminists in particular that have shifted the conversation from questions of identity to questions about structural forces. And then the final sort of historical note that I should mention before moving on is that it's, you know, Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality, and obviously should get all of the credit for that, but the idea was described by others before her. Probably most famously by the Combahee River Collective, who in the late 1970s described systems of power as, quote, interlocking. So they had a similar sort of metaphor. And then even before that, in the 19th century, there were Black women scholars and activists like Anna Julia Cooper, Frances Harper, Sojourner Truth. These women also described intersectionality in practice, if not by name. So in short, intersectional feminism, which provides the underlying framework for our book, it's not just about women and gender, it's about power. It's about who has it and who doesn't. And in today's world, data is power. You know, we can see this in the data is the new oil metaphor that Catherine was talking about earlier, as well as in the observation that Catherine also referenced that data is the same old oppression. And so intersectional feminism, when applied to data science, can help that power be challenged and changed. And our argument really, it's, you know, distilled, it's that data science needs feminism, and intersectional feminism in particular, if we ever hope to overturn these power imbalances. And now I'm going to pass back to Catherine.
So when writing the book, Lauren and I looked across a number of different fields where feminist theorists and feminist activists have engaged with questions of like, how do we do this? Like, how do we apply feminism? So those are things like design fields, like human-computer interaction, art and design, things like feminist approaches to GIS, to STS, to the digital humanities, and so on. And then also, you know, it's thought of what we have brought to the table from just our own sort of embodied experiences of feminism and participating in different kinds of communities, and came up with these 7 principles of data feminism, which we feel like are some of the most important things that feminism may have to offer data science, and also can help us point towards a way forward for how do we work with data science in a way that works towards justice rather than reinscribes the status quo. And so, yeah, that's the goal, is to operationalize feminism for data science. It wasn't really to create new feminist theory, but just to say, well, what do we know already that can be applied in this domain? And that might guide the work of people who want to work with data, or people who may want to work with data in the future, or people, and this is important, who want to refuse to work with data. And that's also a really important political choice as well. And so the principles, and this is also how the book is structured. So each chapter in the book corresponds to one of these principles. And then what we do in the book is try to go through and give examples of both the feminist theory that we're drawing from to introduce it to newcomers, as well as to show examples of people in the world who are already enacting this, who are already doing this work. So the principles are examine power and challenge power. So the first two chapters are power. And so that's like one of the main takeaways, if you're wondering, like, what does feminist bring to data science? Power. So it's all about a kind of doing an analysis of power, meaning structural privilege and structural oppression. And then thinking about ways that we can challenge and change the balance of power. Then we move to thinking about binaries and hierarchies. Elevating emotion and embodiment. Emotion is often exiled from data science and from data communication. Embrace pluralism, which we'll talk about a little bit later, really relates a lot to the process and who's at the table as we create data sets and algorithms and things like this. Considering context, very important, long-standing feminist commitment. And then make labor visible, so showing how the work of data science is the work of many hands. So I think with that, Lauren, I will pass it to you to dive in. So what we're going to do from here is sort of illustrate some of these principles in action with the examples that we draw on in the book.
Sure. So, you know, as Catherine already started to get at, examining power is, you know, really central to the feminist project because of how gender inequality is at root a question of power. And one of the contributions of feminist organizers and activists and also theorists is to give us models that show how power operates in the world. And I should say, you know, there are a lot of ideas about how power operates. Not all of them are feminist theories. Like right now, in the past week, we've seen a lot of discussion about like Louis Althusser and repressive state apparatuses, right? Which applies very well to how, for instance, the US is experiencing the reverberations of the protests across the country. But one of the feminist theories of power that we draw from heavily in the book comes from the Black feminist sociologist Patricia Hill Collins. And she describes power as a matrix of domination, by which she means that power operates not just from the top down, you know, like not just, you know, either the government is doing it overtly or they're doing it covertly, but it operates through this matrix across many layers of society. And we go into this in more detail in the book, but the key point here is that once we have a clear model of how power works in the world, we can start to map sort of experiences and examples that we see to that model, which allow us to understand how it operates and then how we can change it. And so in the book, we talk about Collins's concept of the matrix of domination via the story of the artist and educator Mimi Onuoha in her efforts to collect what she calls missing data sets. So these are data sets that a reasonable person might expect to exist because they address issues of pressing social need, but because of various reasons, they don't actually exist in real life. So these are data sets, like I'm not sure if all of you can read them because the slides may be small on your screen as they are for me, but on the right, you see a list of data sets that include, for instance, trans people killed or injured in instances of hate crime, people excluded from public housing because of criminal records, or for a more topical example that is not on the list, but you know is a real example of this, like a gender and race breakdown of the number of people with COVID, you know, in the US or in the UK. So one version of Onuoha's project is a GitHub repository, and that's actually what you can see in the screenshot on the right. So it lists the missing data sets, and actually you can submit a pull request if you want to contribute a new one. But another version of the project is a physical artwork. That's what you see on the left. It's a physical file cabinet with folders, and each one is labeled with one of these missing data sets. And the idea is that you tab through the folders and look at the labels. But when you open up the folder, if there's an issue that you think like, I'd really like to know more about that, you open up the folder, but it's empty because the data set is missing. Onwoha on the website and in her artist statement explains that these missing data sets, quote, reveal our hidden social biases and indifferences. And by calling attention to these data sets collectively as missing, she also calls attention really helpfully to why these data sets are missing. They're missing because of a lack of personal, social, political, or governmental will. Or some combination of all of those things. Or in the case of coronavirus tests, right, they're missing precisely because of political and governmental will. But in either case, since the data are missing, we cannot move forward with any sort of goal of working towards greater justice or equity in the world.
So, we build on this idea of missing data in chapter 2, where we talk about the principle of challenging power. And this case of femicide or feminicide data is another case of a missing data set. And we should probably say, like, missing data sets are very common for minoritized groups, which would be women, folks of color, and so on, those who hold less power. So in the book, we tell the story of Maria Salguero, who she resolved to head straight towards this problem and collect the missing data herself. So just to back up a little bit, feminicides are gender-based killings, so they're related to gender of women and girls. They include cis and trans women. They're legally defined as crimes in a handful of countries, including in the Mexican context. But even though it's defined a law about feminicide, the state does not actually systematically collect data about the scope and the scale of the problem. And this lack of attention, as well as the failure to sort of prosecute or carry forward cases when they do happen, is the subject of emerging public anger in Latin America. So the hashtag here, Ni Una Menos, I encourage you to check that out for some of the conversation that's been happening on the topic. So frustrated by the state's lack of action, Salguero decided to single-handedly start collecting feminicide data. This was about 5 years ago. And so in the past 5 years, she has actually amassed the largest archive of feminicides in Mexico. And the way she does this is extremely manual. She spends 2 to 4 hours per day logging feminicides on a Google map that she calls her media reports. And what's kind of incredible in a sense about the persistence of logging this kind of data is that now she has the most comprehensive public archive of feminicide data in Mexico. So she has provided her data to journalists and NGOs. She's testified in front of Mexico's Congress multiple times. And she's even helped families locate loved ones who have gone missing. And so the way that we talk about this book and the work is like, this is one way, it's not the only way, but it's one way to challenge in unequal balances of power, is to collect feminist counter data. So this is activist data collection that steps in when the state or other data collecting institutions have systematically failed to do their job at some level. So it represents one way to use data to challenge power. Lauren.
So we just wanted to include a brief mention of a way in which this approach of collecting counter data is being put to use right now with respect to COVID. And just highlight a couple of these initiatives. These are, for the most part, US-based, but I think they would be of interest to an international audience. These are organizations and individuals and very small groups that are doing this exact same thing. Sort of in the absence of governmental will or resources or attention, they are stepping in to fill a need. So we see the New York Times case tracker, which was their attempt and recognition of the fact that there are sort of a lot of different ways to count count COVID cases and deaths. They stated as their goal to create the most comprehensive and inclusive collection of cases in the United States. And they were soliciting reports from, official reporting, but also death notices and obituaries and things like this. And it's become a real global resource, especially as the US leads in cases. The COVID tracking project, another sort of early attempt to step in when federal and national organizations were not. Data for Black Lives, which is an organization that has been in existence for, at this point, a bunch of years, but was quick to recognize the disparate outcomes of COVID on Black communities, and realized at the same time that data were not being collected that identified people according to race or ethnicity, and therefore it was hard to get a sense of the scale of the problem. They are cataloging which states and countries are releasing data by race and ethnicity. The Solutions Journalism Network is collecting COVID data by race and ethnicity at the state level. Although we should note also that sex and gender data is missing from all of these efforts. And then there's also some smaller projects like COVID Black, which is trying to build data literacy around these data sets. But this is an example that we see right now of this approach being put to significant both use and benefit.
So one of the places, so like up till now, most of our examples have had to do with sort of the data collection phase and showing how it is political, like what we choose to collect about and what we neglect, ignore, systematically fail to collect about is a political question. But data feminism sort of applies to all stages of the process, and in particular to the process of sort of making knowledge from data in the first place. So once you have it, then what do you do with it? There are very different ways of conducting a process. Some of them are feminist and some of them are not. And so this comes from the chapter that's about embrace pluralism. This is the idea coming from Donna Haraway that the best knowledge comes from bringing together multiple perspectives. And she actually calls this feminist objectivity. It's a way to get a more complete picture of what's going on. And so in this model, knowledge is not top down, but it's created through dialogue and exchange, which creates a more complete picture of the problem at hand. And we see this embodied in the work of the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, which is on the left. They're also known as AEMP. So they're a self-described collective of housing justice activists, researchers, data nerds, artists, and oral historians. So since 2013, the AEMP has worked to quantify and organize around the housing crisis in San Francisco. They actually now have chapters in a number of different US cities. They make maps, lots and lots of maps. We go to their website, there's like 80 something maps. And they always work in collaboration with tenants' rights organizations and grassroots community groups. And they also, and sort of pretty importantly, create oral histories. And that's what you see on the map on the left, called Narratives of Resistance and Displacement. The red dots on the map are evictions, so where people have been evicted from their homes. And then the blue dot on the map leads to a oral history in form of a video. And that's what you see there is Phyllis Bowie. That's an example of one of the videos that would come up. So these are stories in first person from either a single person or a family who's facing displacement from their home. And in the book, we contrast this work of AEMP with the Eviction Lab, whose work you see on the right. They're based at Princeton University, and their goal is to present a national picture of the eviction crisis in the US. So this is a worthy goal. The project is really interesting. But the main way we compare these two projects is in their process. And the interaction between the two groups is interesting in that regard. We talk about the two groups kind of came to a head with each other around data. So the Eviction Lab, when it was ramping up, it was searching for sources of national data, contacted AEMP, and asked if they would share their data. The AEMP didn't say no, but they said, well, let's hold on a second, let's slow down, let's talk a little bit more. How are you going to make sure that this data doesn't fall into the hands of landlords? Because one of the things they do is they track who are the landlords that are evicting folks, so as to be able to find patterns of bad landlords. But instead of continuing the conversation, the eviction lab turned around and went and purchased lower quality data from a national real estate broker. And then the AAMP in the magazine Shelter Force wrote a strong critique of eviction labs methods. And so one of the things that's interesting here that comes up is that the eviction lab strategy is very typical of big data for social good projects, if you think about it. So it prioritizes speed and size of data over relationship building. Also over quality of data, because one of the points that AEMP makes is actually their data set is of far higher quality. They have far more evictions actually than what Eviction Lab's data set currently characterizes, because of their unique position of being on the ground. Also, the Eviction Lab strategy, their process, where they kind of want to quickly kind of mine, extract, put in a database, visualize, they don't see the process as being part of the work. They want the data. The data and the visualization is the work. The process is not so much, that's not the goal of the work. Whereas for the AEMP, the process is the work. Like it's creating an inclusive and anti-racist community, and a community building process is really central to their goals. That is the work. And so this point is to just say, it's like there's many ways of arriving at a beautiful data visualization, and there's wildly different pathways one can take to get there. And so embrace pluralism is one of those strategies that applies to process in the data science, in the course of doing data science.
So, you know, one of these questions is, you know, so great, we've decided to embrace pluralism in the process of doing data science, but you can't have physically, or usually in terms of resources, every single person's voice at the table. So one question that comes up is, you know, whose voices do we prioritize given limited resources, limited time, and limited capacity? So following the work of, you know, among them, Patricia Hill Collins, who we referenced earlier, Sandra Harding, another feminist theorist of science and technology, Shawen Bardzell, a feminist designer, you know, questions about design that takes power into account often suggest centering the experiences of people at the edges and the margins, first and foremost, and making decisions and designing from the outside in. So as you know, we follow a lot of the guidelines offered by the Design Justice Network. And they say, you can see at the bottom of the slide, we center the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcomes of the design process. And these are the folks that we should really be working hard to build relationships with. So just, you know, one more slide to drive it home. You know, if it's not already apparent, the principles of data feminism apply to every single stage of a data science process project. You know, not just in the point where you are collecting the data, asking what questions, or sort of figuring out what questions to ask, not just at the end when you are communicating the results, but really from inception to funding to production to circulation to impact in the world. I'm going to pass back to Catherine here.
I want to know that this example does involve talking about sexual assault data, in case anybody wants to mute. Moving towards the principle of considering context. So this is chapter 6 in data feminism. And what do we mean by considering context? This really means being very sensitive to the times when data cannot and should never speak for themselves, and knowing when to watch out for that. And so that phrase, again, a kind of a meme that came out in 2008, is this idea of like the numbers. If you have enough data, the numbers will speak for themselves. And this circulates still, I would say, it's part of a kind of like reigning ideology. But in fact, we need to be very careful about letting numbers speak for themselves, because one of the things we say over and over again is data are never raw. we're not new in saying that, but data are an output of a process, and that process is often conducted in a very unequal world. So the data reflect that inequality. And so one example of this sort of in action is looking at sexual assault data. This actually comes from a story that students of mine, I was previously at Emerson College teaching in the journalism department, and my students for the final project came and said, well, we really want to do a story sort of comparing rates of sexual assault on different college campuses. And so we went out and we looked, and we found a comprehensive federal database called the Clery Act reports, has sexual assault, but also a large number of other crimes. So in a sense, we thought like, okay, well, now they can do their project. There's this comprehensive information. And then they started doing exploratory analysis of the data. And to their credit, they started getting suspicious. Because if you just download the data from the Clery Act reports database, and they were looking at Massachusetts in particular, where we were located, you will come to the conclusion that Williams College seems to have an epidemic of sexual assault, whereas Boston University seems to be doing great, but barely a case. And yet that provoked a lot of suspicion, because Williams College is this like small, very wealthy, rural college out in Western Mass. Boston University is much larger. You just expect numbers to be much higher just because of the size, urban. And at that point, one of the reasons that they wanted to do this was because the hockey team at BU had recently been involved in the news around sexual assault. And so through a lot of on-the-ground reporting and interviews, what they found out is that the numbers are showing a picture that is likely closer to the opposite of what they seem to be saying. But in order to know that, you have to understand the context of this particular context, and also context of sexual assault and stigma in the United States, as probably is the case in other countries. So there are a couple of things here that are like sort of power imbalances in the data collection environment. First of all, Clery Act is federally mandated, so everybody has to report. But there are strong incentives not to report, or not to report numbers fully. So first of all, educational institutions self-report numbers to the federal government. No college wants to have a high rate of sexual assault, that there's not an incentive to report more numbers, right? So if we're not allocating money towards a problem and there's very low numbers, we can say, oh, okay, it's not a problem. Secondly, as I think probably all of us on this call know, individuals, survivors, do not come forward, as we know, because of stigma and because of a lack of support. And so when the journalism students investigated this phenomenon, they found that sort of paradoxically, the places with higher rates of sexual assault, like Williams, these were actually the places that were devoting more institutional resources to shifting their climate to incentivize survivors to come forward. And so they're probably still drastically underreporting the actual incidence in the population, but they're at least closer to the truth because they've invested. They had hired staff, they had made a center, they had done all these things to encourage folks to come forward. Whereas other places had made no investment, were not prioritizing it. It was like kind of, again, like Mimi on the Wellhouse Project, easier to just pretend like it doesn't exist. But it's just important to know that if the numbers spoke for themselves in this case, they would be telling a story that is patently false. Like, it's just, the stakes are high because you're literally telling the wrong thing. So considering context, especially in the data analysis phase, becomes a way to account for this, these power differentials, the way that inequality basically infects and influences the numbers. So here I'll pass back to Lauren.
Okay, so we have one last example, which I'll try to move through a little bit quickly so we can get to the Q&A. So the previous examples have focused on the issue of power and people, right? Like of the people who have power and then of the people who don't. But another major idea that comes from feminism relates to what theorists call structures of power, and more specifically binary structures that are defined by sort of a hard distinction between two groups. And feminist theory has helped to show how these binary distinctions are usually hiding a hierarchy, with one group on top and the other on the bottom. And then once you see the hierarchy, you start to understand how that hard line between the groups is there to ensure that one group stays on the top and the other on the bottom. And in other words, that hard line, that binary distinction has been artificially imposed, and it's been imposed because of external desires. So the distinction between the idea of man and the idea of woman that's the obvious reference point. Since it's a clear example both of a false binary and of an unequal hierarchy, right? So there's more than two genders, and among them, no gender is better than any of the others. But one of the key moves of feminist theorists is to take this critique of the gender binary and then use it to question other kinds of binaries and hierarchies that we encounter in the world. So we see this in the distinction between nature and culture, between subject and object, or the one that this principle takes up, which is this artificial distinction between reason and emotion. So in an Anglo-Western context, we've been taught generally that reason is somehow better than emotion. And we see this play out in data, right? And the example that I'm going to talk about briefly has to do with data visualization. So best practices for data visualization often involve clean design, a minimal aesthetic, just presenting just the facts. But the question remains as to why these are our best practices, especially when visualization research has shown that we interpret these aesthetic choices just as emotionally. We tend to believe that minimal charts are more truthful than they actually are. For instance, there's research by Jessica Holman, an information visualization researcher. She and her collaborators have shown that just including a source line for the data, it doesn't matter what it says, but if it just says data, and a URL, it makes people trust visualizations more. It doesn't matter whether the credit line describes an actual source that exists or not. But then what about the opposite? Visualizations that deliberately and unabashedly leverage emotion. And this is what the example that you see here helps us explore. So the large black images that you see are actually, they're screenshots of an animated visualization by the design firm Periscopic. And you can Google it and you can find it, and maybe you even want to watch it as I'm speaking. So what it is of the number of gun-related deaths in the United States in 2 years, 2013 and 2010. Each of the people killed by a gun in that year is represented as a single one of these little arcs. You can see that on the left in the smaller image. And the arcs are traced one by one on the screen. They start out fairly slow so you can read the name of the person, and then they get faster and faster until they sort of overlap and create this semicircular web that you see in the larger image. It's almost, every time I watch it, I have the same response, which is that it's overwhelming. It's almost unbearable. You think it's done, and then it keeps on going to the point where all these lines are occluding each other. But that's the point. There are too many people being killed by guns in the United States. It's an epidemic, right? The definition of an epidemic. Now, methodologically, it's no less statistically sound than any other study, right? The data about the people derived from a national crime data set. Their projected lifespans are determined using a sophisticated statistical model, which relies on lifespan estimates from the World Health Organization. But it was viewed with suspicion from the visualization community because it made us feel. And a feminist approach would say here that that's not a problem at all, right? That it made us feel things. And in fact, it's a more compelling visualization because it blends reason with emotion. So rebalancing emotion and reason rather than rejecting emotion outright really opens up the data communication toolbox and actually allows us to focus on what truly matters in a design process, or for that matter, a data science project more generally. So things like honoring context, really architecting attention and taking action to dismantle these binaries and hierarchies that we encounter and sort of impede our attempts to reimagine the world. So just to wrap up briefly, the book actually contains, we counted, or actually our research assistant counted, 294 projects that we discuss in the book. Those don't include the citations to scholarship, but we hope that this gives you a sense of the type of material that's inside the book. But more generally, sort of what's possible when thinking about data and data science from a feminist perspective.
One last point, we'll go real fast because we want to save a little time at least for questions. We just want to make the point that data feminism, one of the things you'll know as you read the book and as you see from the examples here, is that many of our examples don't look like data science, or they come from worlds that we might not think of as data science. But one of the points that we make is that we need to expand our umbrella for what counts, and that means including already what is counted as data science, also including work by artists, work by data journalists, work in community, which is this data mural, which is by the group Data Therapy that's pictured here. So we really need to start expanding our definition of data science, because all too often it's about how big is your data, how technical were your methods, and so on. And that's kind of what people use to kind of make the box of what counts as data science. So just to sum up, data feminism is data science that exposes and challenges power, is led by and centers minoritized people. It can be a counter data science about injustices created by mainstream data science. We look at many axes of inequality. We consider process, so how inequality permeates all stages of a project. And finally, credits labor. And so it acknowledges how data science is the work of many hands. And hopefully we have time for a couple questions. Here's all of our contact information, and yeah, we'd love to continue the dialogue.
I'll insert here applause from 350 people, because that is one of the horrible things that we don't get with these webinars. Thank you so much for such an inspiring and provocative talk. We have 8 minutes left for questions, and maybe we can push that a little bit. Let's see, but we've already had questions coming in on the Q&A. I'm gonna field those because I see there's a couple of hands raised, but I think we can't do that today. We're gonna just use the Q&A, so please keep submitting them there. We've had a few questions upvoted already. One of them is from an anonymous attendee who absolutely agrees that data is not the new oil. It's a public or common, and not a public or common good. Data is extracted by people who generate it. What do authors think of data as labor? And I note that links to your 7th principle, so I'd love for you to talk a bit more about that.
Lauren, why don't you take that one?
Sure. I mean, I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. And, you know, we do have this chapter in the book about the work involved in data science. And, you know, lo and behold, a lot of ways of thinking about labor more generally that come from feminism really do help us see the ways in which so much of data work is, for instance, invisible, meaning that both that it is invisible to the eyes, that we don't see it taking place, or at least people who are involved in the later stages of a data science project, or certainly the, you know, readers of a report or the perceivers of a data visualization, but also invisible in the economic sense, that it's often either sort of unpaid or underpaid. We see this in a lot of the basis for especially work in the machine learning and AI community that relies on services like, you know, Amazon Mechanical Turk and even AWS for processing power, right? Like these things, and it connects to this issue of sort of oil and resources. Like these things may be perceived to be either invisible or inexpensive to the people who are paying for them, but they are not cheap in terms of either the cost on the people who perform those services or even on the environment, right? And we talk about this a little bit in the book, and we reference, there's a great book called Ghost Work by Mary Gray and Siddharth Suri that talks about this really, they describe it as a global underclass of information workers. Lily Irani is another person who talks about cultural data work. All of these people are just involved in, you know, labeling training data, content moderation, doing quick captions and transcription and things like this. We could not do the work that we do without these other people, and yet these people are rendered invisible, both, you know, actually in terms of credit and economically.
Thank you. There's a question here. What do Catherine and Lauren think about ensuring that data that is available is used for the public good? And if there are any ethical or safeguarding principles that should be thought about, because sadly not everyone will use the data in a good or positive way. And follow-up question, who would be the arbiter to decide what constitutes good use of data. A whole can of worms there.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think like, yeah, it's a great question and also a great follow-up question. And I think that thing about like who's the arbiter points back to this idea of why data are just always political, right? And like how we use them, what we collect, how we process them, and then how we use them, who uses them to make decisions about whom. Like it's like the whole thing is like fraught with politics in a lot of ways. But so I think in terms of ensuring that they're used for public good, I do think this is not our area of expertise, but I think there's like a huge uncharted territory for policy and regulation. And so like what a lot of what is happening, at least in the US context, is like technology is like leapfrogging forward, and then policy is coming in after the fact. So to me, this means like, you know, we need to up the data literacy of our policymakers. Like, for example, there was just a talk at our department from a New York City councilor who was trying to figure out what his position on facial recognition in public housing in New York should look like. Like, should he endorse this? What were the harms? What were the benefits? And I think it's like, again, this points to this like general need for data and algorithmic literacy by the folks who are making the laws and making the policies. So I mean, so I do think there's like that. But then I think there's also things within the data science community and what's within the purview of tech folks, civic tech folks, and information publishers. And like one very concrete thing that we talk about a lot, especially in relationship to open data in the chapter about considering context, is thinking about the ways in which open data can sometimes be very irresponsible. If you're just out there kind of publishing all these data sets and be like, yeah, everyone, go crazy, free downloads, but with no contextual information, with no metadata, with no explanation of why and how the data were collected, it's really easy then for like the kind of things I was talking about with the example of the sexual assault data. People won't be necessarily looking for inequalities. So like what we can do as responsible data publishers is to be providing really good high quality metadata, whether that's in the form of a data biography. Other folks have said things like data sheets or data sets. Other folks publish things called data user guides. And so think about how, when we put things out into the world, how we've done our own audits of ourselves, but also how are we putting out open data, which I endorse. Like, I mean, we're both sort of fans of open data and open publishing, but how do we do that in a way that's responsible and in a way that will highlight and point out in particular limitations around types of analysis that are appropriate, who's been left out, whose voices are missing, subjugated, silenced in the data.
I think that segues really nicely into the question from Frances Bell here about how can data science work with qualitative research and data?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things we talk about in the book, and actually we even talked about in this presentation, is that nothing in the world should be binary, right? If you do qualitative work, it shouldn't preclude you from doing quantitative work. If you do quantitative work, it should not preclude you from doing qualitative work. And these things can go hand in hand very, very easily. And we would argue that both are needed, right? Because, data can tell you a lot of things, but it can't tell you everything. And there are always experiences that are not captured in a data set. And there's always a value in giving voice to particularity, to individual experience, to the specificity that comes from someone's own language, from someone's own experience, and things like this. So, I think, that's what I would say. There's absolutely a place for it. It should be encouraged. The best data science papers that I read these days always take a step back and look at one or two of the sort of key sort of examples that demonstrate the generalized finding. And that leads, again, this is coming back to kind of the thing that Donna Haraway says about feminist objectivity, additional and different kinds of perspectives, whether it's from the perspective of identity or from the perspective of a different method. This leads ultimately to a more complete picture of the problem at hand, and therefore sort of better science.
Thanks. We have so many questions. Kirsty, do you think we have time to ask one more?
Go on. Do one.
I like this one because it's a little bit provocative. So I'd like to end provocatively. It's from Ricky Nafani, and they write, how do you feel about large tech companies co-opting feminist / intersectional ideas and using data science in palliative ways for PR purposes?
Yeah, and I see the comment about like, yeah, leaning in. So I'm reading the whole comment. This is great. Yeah, and the comment, the question ends with, can seemingly liberal tech companies be redeemed? It's such a good comment. Yeah, well, I think lean in is a bunch of garbage. That's my opinion. Like, I don't really know, like, lean in, come on. I feel like I'm like freaking leaning in right now. Like,
a well-timed appearance from my
hey,
attempt
oh yeah. Yeah, lean in, Loie. Lean into the computers. Yeah, I think, okay, so I think for us, you know, one of the things we write about in the book, I'm not really gonna, I don't know about whether big tech can be redeemed. I don't have an answer to that one. But I think one of the things that's really exciting in the US context right now for big tech is we write a little bit in the book about big tech workers getting organized and doing walkouts and starting things in-house and putting pressure on their employers in-house. And that actually has a whole lot more, in a way, a potential for, or I think has more potential for influencing than, you know, people marching in the street against Google or something like that. So I think that for me is one area of sort of exciting work, I guess I would say. And yeah, Lauren, what do you?
I mean, I would just echo Catherine, and I know we're short on time, to say, you know, I'm not sure if big tech can be redeemed. But I think that, you know, as we're seeing with these protests, there is a necessary constant force from the outside, you know, exerting like a magnetic pull constantly, always, to make sure that these companies do not tip over, you know, into the most extreme forms of, you know, corporate surveillance and, you know, overreach as they could be. But the other thing that I'll say, just to echo Catherine and to point people at a interesting essay that takes this further, there's a really good essay by Maura Weigel. I think that was in Logic magazine, that sort of makes the point that, look, you know, we do have this problem right now where tech is consolidated in the hands of these very large corporations, but this makes the people working at these corporations more powerful than they would be just as sole citizens, because they are more proximate to these resources. And actually, Mar Hicks makes the same case in a UK context, talking about the resistance against, believe it was movements to changed the gender on ID cards in the 1960s in Britain. And that's another great essay, a similar argument in a historical context. But if you are proximate to these technology companies, if you work at them, if you are a software developer there, you have more power. And once you recognize that, you can ask, what do I want to do with it? And that's why contributing to these internal organizations and, you know, the memos that have been written, the statements, like, for instance, within Facebook recently about Facebook's decision not to censor our president, who I refuse to name his tweets. You know, these things can command international attention. And I would just urge people who work in these companies, whether by choice or by necessity, to recognize that power and to do something with it.
Thank you. On that note of action, I will draw things to a close. Thank you both so much for this talk. It's felt like we didn't have enough time to really dig in as much as we want to, but I think that shows just how promising this is for everybody. Well, thank you again, and insert here applause that would be happening if this was happening in real space. Thank you again, and thank you everyone for joining us.